The memorial was beautiful. This was the general consensus, expressed in 41 languages across the 14 civilizations that had contributed to its construction. A sphere of dark material, smooth and featureless, approximately the size of a small moon, placed at the coordinates where the human home system had once been, not where Earth specifically had been, where the sun had been. The sphere occupied the gravitational center of what had been a solar system, and was now, after the event, simply a debris field of unremarkable rock and scattered light. The memorial had been constructed over a period of 30 years, which was considered, by all 14 civilizations, a respectful interval, long enough to acknowledge the scale of the loss, not so long that the galactic community could not begin to process and move forward from it. The inscription was a single line, in the Voral standard that served as the closest thing the galactic community had to a universal language. It read, "Here existed a species that refused to be ordinary." The ceremony of dedication attracted representatives from every member of the galactic community, which was, by this point, 207 civilizations. The ceremony lasted 3 days. Speeches were given. Music was played. Some of the attending delegates, from species that produced emotional response through physical expression, wept. No one noticed the small anomaly in the long-range observation data from the memorial's construction sensors. No one noticed because the anomaly was very small, and the sensors were not primarily designed for the kind of precision that would have made it visible to a casual observer, and because no one was looking for it. And because the reason no one was looking for it was that the thing the anomaly would have indicated was, by the consensus of 207 civilizations and 30 years of investigation, impossible. The anomaly indicated, to anyone who would have looked very carefully and known what they were looking at, that the observation sensors of the memorial itself had been observed. From the inside, the first person to notice the anomaly was not a scientist or an intelligence officer or a military analyst. She was an archivist named Vel Oranthos Sil, who was the granddaughter of the Dr. Vel Oranthos, who had corresponded with the human Deo Adegok 60 years earlier, and who had grown up in a family where the study of humans was not just an academic interest, but a kind of inheritance. She noticed it because she was doing what archivists do, which is go through the records looking for things that have been missed. And she was specifically going through the memorial construction records because she had been commissioned to produce the definitive archive of the event and everything surrounding it. And she was the kind of archivist who believed that the definitive archive should include everything, including anomalies. She flagged it in her notes as unusual and continued working. She came back to it 3 weeks later because she could not stop thinking about it. She ran the analysis a second time, using better tools than the construction sensors had used, applying the kind of precision that was not standard practice in memorial construction documentation, but that was available to her because her institution had recently upgraded its processing capacity. The anomaly was larger than it had appeared in the original data. Significantly larger. She sat with this for 2 days. Then she called her grandmother. Dr. Vel Oranthos was 140 years old, which for an Orenthi was old but not extraordinarily so. She had retired from the research program 12 years earlier and spent her time writing, corresponding, and tending a garden she had grown increasingly fond of over the decades. When her granddaughter called and described what she had found, she was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "Send me the raw data." She looked at the raw data for 4 days. Then she called her granddaughter back and said, "I need you to look at something else for me. I need you to look at the deep field observation records from the period between the event and the construction of the memorial. Specifically, the automated long-range sensors that were monitoring the debris field for navigational hazard assessment. I need you to look at them very carefully." Vel Oranthos Sil looked at them very carefully. It took her 6 weeks. At the end of 6 weeks, she called her grandmother again and said, "I found 17 more anomalies." Her grandmother said, "I know, I found 23. There was a silence. Vel Orantho Sil said, "What does it mean?" Her grandmother said, "It means something was in that debris field that was observing the observers. For the entire 30 years of memorial construction, it means something is in that debris field now. And it means that whatever it has been there since before we star." Ted looking. Another silence. Vel Orantho Sil said, "The event was confirmed. The investigation was thorough. 207 civilizations reviewed the data. There were no survivors." Her grandmother said, "Yes." Vel Orantho Sil said, "Then what is in the debris field?" Her grandmother said, "I think we need to go and find out." The request for an expedition to the debris field went through 17 layers of bureaucratic review over the following 4 months, because the event and everything connected to it was a subject of considerable institutional sensitivity, and the suggestion that the confirmed findings of a 30-year investigation conducted by 207 civilizations might have missed something was not a suggestion that any bureaucratic body wanted to be associated with if it turned out to be wrong. The expedition was eventually authorized, quietly, as a scientific survey for updated navigational hazard assessment, which was a description that was technically accurate and which did not require anyone to explain publicly what the expedition was actually looking for. The expedition team was small. Dr. Vel Oranthos, who had insisted on going personally and who at 140 years old had the specific kind of authority that comes from having been right about difficult things before, her granddaughter, 3 technical specialists, a pilot, no military personnel, which had been Dr. Vel Oranthos' specific condition for her participation. They arrived at the debris field on a morning that was, by the only calendar anyone was using, the 31st anniversary of the event. The debris field looked exactly like what it was supposed to be: scattered rock, mineral fragments, the residual signatures of energies that had been released 3 decades ago and had been dissipating since. The memorial sphere, dark and smooth, occupying the gravitational center, everything exactly as the records described. The technical specialists began their passive observation sweep, which was the agreed protocol. Look before you do anything else. The sweep took 8 hours. At the end of 8 hours, the lead technical specialist said, "There is something here that is not in the records." Dr. Vel Oranthos said, "Show me." What the passive sweep had found was not obvious. It required knowing what to look for, which the technical specialists did because Dr. Vel Oranthos had briefed them extensively. What it showed, when the data was processed through the correct filters, was a pattern. Not a pattern in the debris, a pattern in the spaces between the debris. The spaces were not random. In a naturally occurring debris field, the distribution of empty space follows predictable mathematical principles based on the original mass distribution of the system and the dynamics of the event that had created the field. The spaces in this field followed those principles almost perfectly. Almost. The deviations were extremely small. Individually, each deviation was within the margin of natural variation. Collectively, the deviations formed something that the technical specialists' analysis software, when it finally finished running, categorized as structured. The spaces were arranged in a pattern. The pattern was not random. Vel Oranthos Sil looked at the pattern for a long time. Then she said, "This is a signal." The lead technical specialist said, "It appears to be." She said, "In what format?" He said, "That is the part I cannot identify. The format does not match any communication standard in the archive." Vel Oranthos Sil looked at her grandmother. Her grandmother looked at the pattern. She said, "It matches a format I have seen before, not in the archive, in the personal records my family has maintained for 60 years, in the correspondence between my predecessor and a human named Deo Adegok. She paused. She said, Deo once described to me the way humans formatted certain categories of messages that were designed to be found by someone looking for them, but not obvious to someone who was not. She said humans had developed this because they had, in their history, many occasions when they needed to communicate in ways that were visible only to the intended recipient. She said, this is that format. The silence in the ship was the specific silence of 6 people arriving simultaneously at a conclusion that none of them had wanted to reach, but that the data was making unavoidable. Vel Oranthosil said, what does it say? Her grandmother said, I do not know yet, I know the format, I do not have the key. She paused. She said, but I know someone who might. The transmission went out on a frequency that was not standard, a frequency that had been used 60 years ago for a specific correspondence that had been archived in the family's private records and that Dr. Vel Oranthos had maintained access to for her entire career because she had believed, without being able to explain exactly how she believed it, that access might someday matter. The transmission contained a single element. The 47 minutes of music by Reloram Saris, sent whole and unedited into the debris field. Not a message, not a question, not an identification of the senders. Simply the music. Dr. Vel Oranthos had thought carefully about what to send. She had thought about it for 12 hours after they confirmed the signal format. She had considered sending a linguistic message. She had considered sending coordinates. She had considered sending the data from the anomaly analysis, which would have communicated that they knew what they were looking at. She had decided on the music, because the music communicated something that none of the other options could communicate, which was not information but recognition. The music said, we are people who know this music. We are people who know what it costs to make it. We are people who have been in a room with someone who listened to it for 47 minutes and came out different. We are not just observers. We are people who have been paying attention in the specific way that attention becomes knowing. The music said, we know you. They waited. The wait was 22 hours. During the 22 hours, no one on the ship slept. They kept the passive observation sweep running and watched the data and did not speak very much, and when they did speak, it was not about what they were waiting for, but about small things, ordinary things, the specific conversation of people who are in the presence of something enormous and need the ordinary to stay grounded in. At hour 22, the passive sweep registered a change in the debris field. Not a dramatic change. The memorial sphere, which had been dark and featureless for 31 years, displayed a brief pulse of light on its surface, a pattern of light, lasting approximately 4 seconds. The technical specialists recorded it and ran it through the analysis software. The software said, structured, same format as the original signal, but this time with a key. The key was embedded in the pattern of the light pulse. The message and the means to read the message delivered simultaneously. A human design choice, Dr. Vel Oranthos noted, because humans had learned from long experience with communications that might not reach their intended recipient, to build the context into the message itself. The technical specialists worked for 6 hours to extract and decode the full message. The message was long. It was the longest transmission Dr. Vel Oranthos had ever received in her career. It contained multiple layers, multiple sections, text and data, and something that the analysis software categorized as a compressed archival package, which would take additional time to decompress and review. The first layer was the one they read first. It began, "Hello, it has been a long time. We are glad you found the signal and we are glad you sent the music. We recognize it. We have been keeping the record." It continued, "We want to explain several things. We will try to be clear and also honest. which in our experience are sometimes different objectives that require different kinds of care. The first thing we want to explain is the event. The event happened. We want to be clear about this because we imagine the question in your mind right now is whether the investigation was wrong, whether what was recorded was real, whether the data that 207 civilizations reviewed for 30 years was accurate. It was accurate. The event happened. The sun was destroyed. The planets were destroyed. The system that had been our home for the entirety of our existence as a species was gone in a period of approximately 14 hours. What the investigation did not find, because it was not looking for it and because we were very careful that it would not be found, was that most of us were not there when it happened. We want to explain how that is possible. Approximately 40 years before the event, we became aware that the event was coming, not from external intelligence, from our own observation of our own sun. We have been watching our own sun for a very long time, with a precision that most galactic civilizations do not maintain, because most galactic civilizations have not had the specific history of nearly destroying themselves that we have had, and that history has made us very attentive to things that could destroy us. What we observed 40 years before the event was a stellar process that our physicists assessed as likely to produce a catastrophic energy release within a window of 30 to 50 years. The margin of uncertainty was significant. The probability of survival for anyone in the system when the release occurred was effectively zero. We had 30 to 50 years. We have been, in our history, very good at doing things in 30 to 50 years when the alternative is extinction. What we did in those 30 to 50 years is the second thing we want to explain. We evacuated. Not visibly, not in any way that would have been apparent to the galactic community that was, by this point, observing us with considerable interest. We evacuated quietly, through mechanisms that we had developed during the period when we were describing ourselves to the galactic community as mid-construction and asking for time, and that we continued to develop during the 60 years of formal galactic membership that followed. We are a species with a long history of doing things we do not announce. Not because we are deceptive by nature. We are, in fact, quite bad at deception in most contexts, as anyone who has spent time with us in ordinary circumstances would confirm. We announce ourselves constantly. We tell our stories to everyone we encounter. We make ourselves known. But we learned, in our history of nearly destroying ourselves many times, that there are categories of action that are safest when they are not announced. Not because we want to harm anyone by keeping them private, because announcing them creates vulnerabilities that not announcing them avoids. The evacuation was one such category. We spent 40 years quietly moving people. Not all people. We will be honest about this. The evacuation was imperfect, as our evacuations historically have been, and it was also a choice made under conditions of extreme constraint. We could not move everyone. We moved as many as we could, which was approximately 92% of the population that existed at the time the decision was made, accounting for subsequent births during the evacuation period. 8% of our population died in the event. We want to be clear about this number because we will not pretend that the decision to conceal the evacuation did not have costs. It had costs. People died who might have been saved if we had asked for help. We made a calculation that asking for help would have made the evacuation impossible, because announcing that our star was failing would have triggered a response from the galactic community that we could not have managed while also moving 92% of our population. And the response would have been well-intentioned and also counterproductive, and the net result would have been a lower survival rate. We made the calculation. We believe we made the right calculation. We also acknowledge that 8% of our population is not an abstraction, and that the calculation was made under conditions that allowed no good options, only less bad ones. The third thing we want to explain is what we have been doing for the past 31 years. We have been here. not in the debris field specifically, though we have maintained observation posts in the debris field for the reasons that the anomaly analysis presumably told you. We have been in the places we moved to during the evacuation, which are places that we chose specifically because they were not obvious, and which we have spent the past 31 years making into homes. We have also been watching. We have watched the investigation. We have watched the deliberations. We have watched the memorial construction, which we want you to know we found genuinely moving, whatever complicated feelings we have about the situation it commemorates. The inscription in particular. Here existed a species that refused to be ordinary. We have discussed that inscription at length. We have several opinions about it. The dominant opinion is that it is accurate but premature, because we still exist and therefore the inscription is technically incorrect, but that correcting it would require a conversation we are not ready to have in public yet, and so we have let it stand. We want to tell you why we are having this conversation now. We have been ready to have it for some time. We have been watching for the right moment, which is a very human thing to do and which is also, we acknowledge, a thing that can become an excuse for perpetual delay. We have been watching for someone to come looking in the right way, and you came looking in the right way. Not because you found the anomaly, though finding the anomaly required the kind of careful attention that we have always respected. Because of what you sent when you found it. You sent the music. You did not send a demand. You did not send an official communication or a formal inquiry or an identification of your institutional affiliation. You sent 47 minutes of music made by a member of a species that made a treaty with humans 60 years ago because a commander listened to the music and found it changed what he was willing to do. You sent something that told us you knew us. Not as a strategic calculation, not as the entity in the debris field, as people. We have been waiting for someone who knew us as people. We acknowledge that this is a high standard and that it has resulted in 31 years of silence. We acknowledge, DGE, that the silence has had consequences for the galactic community that we could not have predicted in full, and that some of those consequences were harmful, and that we are sorry for the harm. We are also not sorry for the silence itself, because the silence was necessary, and we have been, in our history, a species that survives by doing necessary things even when the necessary things are hard. We are still alive. We are approximately 14 billion people, distributed across 7 locations that we are not yet ready to disclose publicly, but that we are willing to disclose to you personally, if you want to know, with the understanding that what you do with the information is your decision. We are still arguing. We are still building things, and then looking at what we built and deciding they need to be different. We are still, some of us, watching the sky the way our ancestors watched it, with the specific human feeling of being pulled toward what is out there. We are still here. We thought you should know. The message continued for many more pages. Dr. Vel Oranthos read all of it. Then she sat quietly for a very long time in the particular stillness of her species. Then she said, I need to think carefully about how to respond. Vel Oranthos still said, we need to think carefully about who we tell. Her grandmother said, yes, both of those things are true and they are also related. She paused. She said, I want to tell you what I am feeling because I think it is relevant information. Vel Oranthos still waited. Her grandmother said, I am feeling the specific feeling that my predecessor described in her correspondence with Deo Adego, which is the feeling of recognizing something across a significant difference. I am feeling that I have been in correspondence with a human who is not here and is also, apparently, somewhere, and that the correspondence that happened and the humans who are somewhere, and the 31 years of silence, and the memorial, and the inscription, and the music and all of it, is part of one continuous thing that has been happening since before I was involved in it. She said, I am feeling that this is a situation that was always going to resolve this way. Not because it was predetermined, because of who the humans are, and because of who my family has been in relation to them, and because the music that my predecessor valued enough to put in the archive, and that I valued enough to bring on this expedition, is now the reason that a conversation that has been 31 years in the making is finally happening. She said, I am feeling that the 47 minutes matters. Vel said, yes. Her grandmother said, the response I want to send is not an official communication. It is not a diplomatic inquiry. I want to send the response that a person sends to another person when they have received news that changes everything. Vel said, what does that response look like? Her grandmother thought for a long time. Then she said, it looks like the truth. The specific particular personal truth of what I am feeling, which is that I am 140 years old, and I spent 30 years after the event believing that a species I had devoted my professional life to understanding was gone, and the species is not gone, and I am sitting in a ship in the debris field of their home system, reading a message from them that tells me they watched us build a memorial to their extinction and found it moving. And I am genuinely not sure what to do with any of this, except to tell them honestly what it is like to be on this side of the conversation. She said, I think that is the response they are waiting for, not the official response, the human response. Vel said, you sound like Deo. Her grandmother said, I have been corresponding with humans directly and indirectly for 60 years. Some of it was bound to transfer. She said this without complaint. She said it the way she said most things, which was with the specific quality of someone who has looked at what has happened to them and decided to find it interesting rather than anything else. She composed the response over 4 hours. It was not short. It addressed the things the message had described: the event, the evacuation, the calculation, the 8%, the 31 years. It addressed each of these things honestly, which meant acknowledging the complicated feelings they produced, which meant acknowledging that being told that a species you had mourned for 30 years was actually alive produced not just relief, but also something more difficult, something that was not quite anger and not quite confusion, and was something in between that did not have a clean name in Orenthi. It acknowledged that the silence had been a choice with costs, and it did not pretend that acknowledging the costs made the costs disappear. And then it said what she had told her granddaughter she wanted to say. It said, I am 140 years old and I spent 30 years believing you were gone. My predecessor spent her career trying to understand you, and she is in the archive. My granddaughter found the anomaly because we are the kind of family that looks at everything. I sent you the music because it was the truest thing I could think of to send. It said, I do not know what the right response is to what you have told me. I know that this conversation needs to be much longer and that it needs to involve more people, and that there are decisions here that are far above the level of a scientific expedition. And I also know that before any of that happens, I want to say something simple. It said, I am glad you are alive. It said, I have been, I realize, hoping you were alive for 31 years without knowing I was hoping, the way you hope for things that seem impossible, in the way that you keep a small part of the mind available for impossibilities just in case. I kept my grandmother's correspondence. I named my granddaughter after myself, so the family would continue to be associated with the work. I sent a music recording into a debris field instead of a formal inquiry, because something in me wanted you to know that the people looking were the people who had always been paying attention. It said, I am glad it worked. It said, I am also, I want to be clear, going to have to figure out what to do next, which is a large question that I am not going to try to answer today. Today, I am just going to tell you that I am glad. It said, my granddaughter wants me to tell you that she is glad too. It said, the technical specialists on this ship, who did not know what we were looking for when this expedition started, and who have spent the last 22 hours processing a realization that has significantly altered their understanding of recent galactic history, wanted me to tell you that they have questions, which is, I think, the most Orenthy way to react to this situation that I can imagine. It said, the pilot wants me to tell you that he is not sure how to log this in his flight report and is hoping for guidance. It said, the music is playing again in the background as I write this. I put it on without thinking. I think that is accurate. The response went out on the same frequency as the original transmission. The reply came in 6 hours. It was shorter. It said, we are glad too. We have been glad for 31 years that someone was keeping the record. We have been watching the archive. We want you to know that. It said, the pilot can log it as anomaly investigation, outcome classified, pending further review. We have some experience with documentation that does not want to explain itself yet. It said, we have questions too. We have a lot of questions. We have been accumulating questions for 31 years, and we are very good at accumulating things. It said, the music. We want to tell you something about the music. It was played at the memorial service we held privately on the first anniversary of the event. Not a service for us, we are alive. A service for the 8%. We played it because someone in the archive had written about a commander who listened to 47 minutes of music and found it changed what he was willing to do. And someone at the service said, we should be the kind of people who play music for our dead, not because it changes anything but because it is true, and that is the right reason to do anything. It said, we have been playing it every year on the anniversary since. It said, it is the anniversary today. Dr. Vel Oranthos looked at this, and then looked at Vel Oranthos' sill, and then looked out the viewport at the debris field and the memorial sphere and the smooth dark surface that read, in a single line of inscription, here existed a species that refused to be ordinary. She said, we are going to need a longer conversation. Vel Oranthos' sill said, yes. She said, and we are going to need to decide very carefully who we tell and how and when. Vel Oranthos' sill said, yes. She said, and we are going to need to think about the inscription. Vel Oranthos' sill said, what about the inscription? Her grandmother said, it says here existed. It is in the past tense. They are alive. Past tense is incorrect. Vel Oranthos' sill said, we cannot change the inscription without explaining why we are changing it. Her grandmother said, no, we cannot. And so the question of the inscription is actually the question of when and how to tell the rest of the galactic community that what we all believed for 31 years is not true. She paused. She said, I want to send one more message before we make any decisions. I want to ask them something. Vel Oranthos' sill said, what? Her grandmother said, I want to ask them what they want, not what they need, not what the strategic situation requires, what they want, for themselves, for their children who were born in the evacuation inn, who have never seen their home system, and who know it only as a debris field with a memorial at the center. I want to ask them what they are hoping for. She sent the message. The response took 12 hours. When it came, it was not from a single sender. The header indicated that it had been composed collectively, which the analysis software identified as a document with multiple contributing authors, which was, Dr. Vel Oranthos reflected, a very human way to answer the question. The response said, we want to come home. It said, we know that home does not exist anymore. The system is gone. The planet is gone. The particular gravity and the particular light and the particular smell of a particular morning on a world we have not seen for 31 years are gone, and the people who remember them are aging, and the people who were born after the evacuation have never known them, and home in the literal sense is not a thing we can have. It said, we want to come home the way home is possible for people who no longer have a home, which is to come back to the people who knew them when home existed, and to the places in the galaxy that they built things in, and to the conversations they were having before the silence. It said, "We want to stop being extinct." It said, "We have been arguing about how to do this for 31 years. We are very good at arguing. The argument has produced a general agreement that we cannot simply announce ourselves, because the announcement would need to include an explanation of why we were silent for 31 years, and the explanation is complicated, and complicated explanations require trust in the people receiving them, and we were not sure we had that trust, and we were not sure we had earned it by being silent for 31 years. It said, and then you sent the music. It said, "We want to tell you what the music meant to us. Not the music specifically, though we have history with the music that we have described. We mean the choice to send the music. The choice to send something that said you knew us rather than something that said you were looking for us. The choice to trust that if we were there, we would understand what the music was saying, which was, we are people who have been paying attention. We are not just looking for the thing in the debris field. We are looking for you." It said, "We want to come back to a galaxy that has people in it who know us. Not the aggregate record, not the archive, not what we were before the event. Us as we are now, which is different from what we were and also continuous with it, in the way that all living things are different from what they were and also continuous with it." It said, "We want to tell our story. We have a lot of it. 31 years of living and building and arguing and making things and losing things and finding things and being alive in the specific human way, which is loudly and continuously and with a lot of conversation about everything." It said, "We want to have the conversation." It said, "We are asking you to help us figure out how to start." Dr. Vel Oranthos read this message 3 times. Then she said to her granddaughter, "I know what we are going to do." Vel Oranthos still said, "Tell me." Her grandmother said, "We are going to do what my predecessor did when she found out that a species she had been studying for 30 years was more than she had understood. We are going to go back, and we are going to tell someone we trust, carefully, with full context, and we are going to ask them to help us figure out the right way to tell the rest." She said, "And before we do any of that, we are going to respond to this message. And we are going to tell them that we will help them figure out how to start, because that is what you do when someone who has been silent for 31 years asks for help coming back." She said, "You help them." She sent the response. The conversation that followed lasted 4 months, conducted through the frequency that Dr. Vel Oranthos had maintained access to for 60 years, and that was now serving its intended purpose. It involved, gradually, more people, representatives of the human communities in their 7 locations, counterparts in the galactic community who were brought in carefully and in confidence, experts in the specific challenge of introducing a correction to a settled historical record at a scale that had no precedent. There was no precedent because no species had ever done this before. No species, in the documented history of the galactic community, had survived its own extinction. There were many arguments about how to proceed. The arguments were, the human participants noted privately to each other, extremely familiar in character, because they were the kind of arguments that happen when a large number of people have to make a complicated decision together, which was a thing humans had been doing for 200,000 years and which they had developed through pract. Ice, certain capabilities for that other species, sometimes found surprising. The capability that proved most useful was the one that Counselor Adiz Obi-Mensa had demonstrated 60 years earlier, which was finding the thing that everyone in the room could accept. The thing everyone in the room could accept was this. The announcement would be made. It would be made honestly with full explanation of the event, the evacuation, the calculation, the costs, and the 31 years of silence. It would be made with an acknowledgement of the complicated feelings the announcement would produce in the galactic community, and without any attempt to manage or minimize those feelings. It would be made as a request. We are asking to come back. We understand if the answer is complicated. We are prepared for the conversation to be long and difficult. We believe the conversation is worth having. The announcement would not be made by a diplomatic representative or a government official. It would be made by a woman named Sujin Park, who was 53 years old, who had been born on the colony that had broadcast for 19 days during a military operation 30 years earlier, who had read at the memorial service of Marco Benedetti, who had become an archivist, and who was the child of a woman who had once said to her daughter, "Maybe they do not know us." She was chosen because she was not a diplomat or a politician or a military figure. She was chosen because she was an archivist, which meant she kept records, which meant she understood that the way a thing is told matters as much as the thing itself. She was chosen because she had spent her career making sure things were not forgotten. She was chosen because she had been, since she was 8 years old, the specific kind of human that other humans pointed to when they wanted to explain what being human was, which was not a person who did extraordinary things, but a person who did ordinary things with the specific quality of full attention that made the ordinary into something else. She was also chosen because when she was told about the situation and asked if she would be willing to make the announcement, she said, "Yes." And then she said, "Can I tell my mother first?" Her mother was 81 years old and still living on the colony where the broadcast had happened, and where Marco Benedetti's library still stood, and where the 18 Days wing still held the records of what had happened during 19 days 3 decades ago. She called her mother. She told her. Her mother was quiet for a long time. Then she said, I told you they were people." Sujin Park said, "You said maybe they do not know us." Her mother said, "I meant the other they, the ships, and I meant it as a question." Sujin Park said, "I know." Her mother said, "And now we know they were watching, all the time. They were watching and they were alive and they were there." Sujin Park said, "Yes." Her mother was quiet again. Then she said, "I am going to tell you something I have thought about for a long time. When you were 8 years old and you asked why the ships were doing this and I said I do not know, I meant I genuinely did not know the strategic reason, the Empire's logic. But there was a part of me that knew something else, which was that whatever the reason was not about us. The reason was about the Empire and its needs and its calculations. And that meant that the reason could be changed, because calculations can be changed when the information changes." She said, "And now I am thinking about the humans watching, all those years, watching the investigation and the memorial and the inscription, watching the galactic community grieve them, staying quiet because staying quiet was the necessary thing. And then a music recording arrives in the debris field of their home system from an Orenthi archivist who kept the correspondence of a predecessor who kept the correspondence of a predecessor, and they answer." She said, "They answered because the music told them the information had changed, that there were people looking who knew them, and knowing changed the calculation." Sujin Park said, "That is what Dr. Vel Oranthos said." Her mother said, "We are very old, Dr. Vel Oranthos and I, we are very old, and we have both spent our lives being in rooms where impossible things became possible, and we have both learned the same thing about it, which is that the impossible becomes possible when enough people know enough of the truth to make a different calculation." She said, "Go make the announcement, tell the truth, all of it, let them make a different calculation." Sujin Park made the announcement from the surface of the colony, standing in front of the Meridian Archive, the rebuilt library where Marco Benedetti had salvaged what he could from the ruins of 300 years of books and built something larger than what had been there before. She stood in front of it because it was the right place, because it was a place where things that had been destroyed had been rebuilt, because it was a place where the record was kept. She spoke for 40 minutes. She told the truth, all of it, in the specific way she had practiced for 3 weeks, which was the way that archivists tell things, with full context and precise language and the specific acknowledgement of everything that was complicated, because the complicated things were also part of the record, and leaving them out would make the record incomplete. She told it the way her grandmother's generation had told the story of the 19 days, with names, with specific people, with the particular and the human scale rather than the aggregate and the abstract. She said, "The people who are alive include the grandchildren of people who stood on Earth and looked up at the sky and felt something pulling them toward it. Those grandchildren have never seen Earth. They grew up looking up at different skies. They are still looking." She said, "We are 14 billion people distributed across 7 locations that we are now prepared to share. We are still arguing. We are still building. We have spent 31 years becoming something new, and we do not yet know exactly what it is, but we are the kind of species that finds out by showing up and seeing what happens." She said, "We are asking to come back. We understand that this is complicated. We understand that there are many things to discuss and many things to work through, and that the discussion will be long and the working through will be longer. We are prepared for that. We are, in our history, a species that is prepared for long and difficult things when the alternative is not being here." She said, "We are still here." She said, "We have been watching." She said, "We are glad to be seen." The galactic community's response was, as predicted, complicated. There was shock. There was confusion. There was anger from some quarters, directed at the silence and the calculation and the 31 years. There was relief from other quarters that was as uncomplicated as relief ever is. There was the specific quality of response that comes from a very large number of beings processing a revision to something they had believed was settled, which takes time and which produces, in the processing, a wide range of reactions that do not resolve into a single consensus quickly. The conversation, as promised, was long. It was also, as promised, worth having. The inscription on the memorial was not immediately changed. This was the decision of the humans themselves, who requested, through Sujin Park, that the inscription remain as it was for a period of 1 year, because they wanted to hold a service at the memorial for the 8%, and they wanted to hold it with the inscription as it was, because the inscription was a record of what the galactic community had believed, and the record should stand as the record, and what happened after the record could be added to it but should not replace it. The service was held on the 32nd anniversary of the event. It was attended by representatives of all 207 galactic civilizations, and by humans from all 7 locations, and by Dr. Vel Oranthos, who was 141 years old and who had flown to the debris field for the 2nd time in a year because it was the right thing to do. The 47 minutes of music was played. When it was over, Sujin Park stood at the inscription and read it aloud. Here existed a species that refused to be ordinary. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The tense is incorrect. It will be corrected, but first I want to say something about why it is incorrect." She said, "We refuse to be ordinary. We refuse to be ordinary. We will, in all probability, continue to refuse to be ordinary. It is one of the most consistent things about us across 200,000 years of being us. We are relentlessly, inconveniently, sometimes exhaustingly committed to being more than the numbers suggest, and more than the assessments predict, and more than anyone looking at us from the outside has ever quite expected." She said, including, it should be noted, ourselves. She said, "We survived our own extinction. We watched our memorial built. We listened to the galactic community grieve us. We waited for someone who knew us. And when someone arrived with 47 minutes of music and the patience to send it into a debris field and wait 22 hours for an answer, we answered." She said, "We are here. We are still here. We will make the inscription present tense. But first we wanted to say, we know what it cost. We know what 31 years costs. We know what the 8% costs. We know what silence costs. We made the calculations and we would make them again because the alternative was not being here to make any calculations at all. She said, "We are sorry for what T." He silenced cost. "We are not sorry for being alive." She said, "We are going to be very busy for a very long time. We have 31 years of catching up to do and approximately 14 billion opinions about how to do it." She paused. She said, "We also have a request. We would like to keep the observation posts in the debris field, not for surveillance, for the same reason that all our ancestors kept watching the sky, because this is where we came from, because watching where you came from is part of knowing who you are, because the record should be maintained." She said, "We are archivists. We keep things. We kept ourselves for 31 years. We would like to keep watching this place where we used to be for as long as we are somewhere else." The request was granted. The inscription was changed the following morning. It now reads, "In the Voral standard that serves as the closest thing the galactic community has to a universal language. Here came from a species that refuses to be ordinary." The change of tense was noted by every civilization in the galactic community. The change from existed to came from was proposed by Dr. Vel Oranthos, who sent a message to Sujin Park 2 days before the service that said, "Exists is present tense and accurate, but it describes what you are now without describing the relationship to this place, which is not just that you exist but that you came from here, and the coming from is part of what you are, and the inscription should say that." Sujin Park read the message and then sent it to the committee that was handling the inscription question with a single note that said, "She is right." The committee agreed. Dr. Vel Oranthos, standing at the memorial on the 32nd anniversary, read the new inscription and said nothing. Her granddaughter standing beside her said, "What are you thinking?" She said, "I am thinking that the music was the right thing to send." She said, "I am thinking that my predecessor would have done the same thing." She said, "I am thinking that 31 years is a long time to hold a hope that something impossible is true." She said, "I am also thinking that the hope was correct, and that the specific kind of attention that allowed us to find the anomaly and to send the music rather than a formal inquiry, and to recognize the signal format from a 60-year-old family archive, that kind of attention is its own kind of thing, a thing that takes time to develop and that cannot be replaced by any other method." She said, "I am thinking that paying attention over a long period of time to things that matter is also a way of refusing to be ordinary." She looked at the inscription. She said, "I am glad it is present tense." Her granddaughter said, "So am I." They stood together at the memorial in the debris field where a sun had once been, and where a species had once lived, and where the same species was now not extinct but present, watching from the debris and the observation posts and 7 locations, and the particular human way of watching which was to watch, and also to tell you they were watching, and also to send music into the silence, and wait to see if someone who knew them was listening. Someone was. Someone had always been. That was the record. That was what had been happening the whole time.